Hey, I'm back. Tonight's speaker is Bethany Bolling. She received her BS and MS degrees from the University of North Texas and a PhD from microbiology from Colorado State. She did her postdoctoral training at the CDC Arboviral Disease Branch in Fort Collins, Colorado, and also at the University of Texas Medical Branch in Galveston. She's currently the team lead for the Arbovirus Entomology Lab at the Texas Department of State Health Services and helps coordinate mosquito surveillance efforts for the state. And with that, I'll turn it over to Bethany and we'll learn a little bit about mosquitoes and all the bad things they bring.
Great. Thank you so much. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and then I'm going to minimize my video, so hopefully I don't cover up anything.
Looks good. And I should just mention, if you do have a question for Dr. Bethany Bolling, please enter that in the Q&A or the chat, and we'll get her to answer those at the end of the presentation. So take it away, Bethany.
So thank you again for this opportunity to come and speak to your group. I'm going to be talking about mosquito-borne diseases. So this is one of my favorite topics to talk about. As was mentioned, I work at the State Health Department and I oversee the Arbovirus Entomology Laboratory. And just to give you a little background about what I do and what we do at our laboratory. So we're located in Austin, on the State Health Department main campus. And this building here is our laboratory. And in this building, there's a lot of different services that are provided, but our laboratory specifically provides mosquito identification and mosquito testing. So what happens is we have participants all throughout the state, different agencies, health departments, universities, counties, cities, that send us mosquitoes from their local area. They send them to us throughout the year. We identify those mosquitoes to species, and then we provide testing from May through November for different arboviruses. The reason we only test from May through November is that's because that's when you would typically see virus activity in Texas. We also do horse testing, so when equine specimens are submitted to the state for rabies testing and they're negative for rabies, we also test those for arboviruses. And then also recently we started providing insecticide resistance testing. And this is a service that can help local jurisdictions determine if they are doing any type of mosquito control, they want to make sure that they're using something that's actually working. And so if they're noticing that their mosquito control efforts are not working, we can do an assessment or run some tests to see if their mosquitoes are actually resistant to the insecticides that they're using. So that's just a brief overview of what we do in our laboratory. So that's kind of what I do every day. But what I want to talk about today for this presentation is kind of give a little bit of a background information about vector-borne diseases, talk about what vector species are, and then we'll focus in on mosquitoes. And then I'd like to talk about different mosquito-borne diseases in Texas, some that are more prevalent than others, and then some that we've had issues with, but we don't really see too often, but just diseases that you should be aware of living in Texas. And then at the end, I'll close up with some protective measures that you should be aware of. So what are vector-borne diseases? These are diseases that are caused by different pathogens like parasites, viruses, or different types of bacteria, and they're transmitted to humans or between animals, and they're transmitted by different types of insects or bugs like mosquitoes, sandflies, ticks, and there's some examples here, midges. So there's different types of insects or bugs that can be vectors and that can transmit these different types of pathogens. And overall, vector-borne diseases are expanding, and this is a problem, and this has been happening, more recently, but actually for a long time. And there's many reasons why vector-borne diseases are expanding. For example, rapid urbanization and changing of land use patterns. This creates situations where you have people coming into areas that they were not present before, and there's these natural transmission cycles where viruses are circulating in animal populations, and then people come in and start changing things, and that disrupts the natural cycles, and then people come in contact with different animals and viruses, and so the viruses can be spread, and even the vectors themselves can go into new places. Obviously, increased international travel and trade is a big component, because you can have viruses present in people, and then they travel across to the other side of the world, and they can introduce a virus into a new area, or even the vectors themselves can be, get stuck on an airplane or on a boat and be introduced into a new area. So these are different ways that vectors or vector-borne diseases can expand or go into new areas. And then climate change or other environmental changes can facilitate the expansion of vector-borne diseases. For example, for mosquitoes, they obviously prefer warmer environments. And so as we experience a warmer climate or climate change in certain areas, it could create habitat that's more suitable for mosquitoes or different types of mosquitoes where maybe they weren't found before. And then another example is animal movement. If you think about migratory birds and where they travel to different parts of the world during different times of the year, they can be in one area for mating potentially and get bit by mosquitoes and then have a virus start replicating in their body, and then they travel somewhere else and then start a new transmission cycle for that virus in a different area. And it's actually hypothesized that that's how West Nile virus was actually introduced into New York in 1999, was by migratory birds. So these are different things that can play into the expansion of vector-borne diseases. So what are vector species? These are living organisms that can transmit different types of pathogens, like I mentioned, like bacteria or viruses, between humans or from animals to humans or from animals to other animals. Many of these vectors are what we call hematophagous, and that means they're blood-sucking. They need blood for part of their life cycle. And what happens is when they take in this blood meal, they're ingesting pathogens from an infected host, whether it's human or animal. And then when they take another blood meal later, they can inject that pathogen into another host during their subsequent blood meal. So that's kind of the basis for what a vector is. And here's a graph. This is from CDC, and this just kind of shows what we're seeing in the US as far as disease cases from vectors. And this graph includes mosquitoes, ticks, and fleas. And when we look at disease cases going back to 2004 up until 2016, there's been a slow increase, but then more of a dramatic increase in 2016. And so this is something to be, have your eyes on and be aware of, that vector-borne diseases are increasing. And I think a lot of the numbers in 2016 had to do with Zika virus. And what also can play into this is increased surveillance efforts can also, inflate your numbers. But I think overall, as I mentioned in the previous slides about vector-borne diseases expanding, it is something to be aware of. And I know CDC is doing more to increase surveillance efforts throughout the US. And when we're thinking about vector-borne diseases, actually mosquitoes are one of the most important. And if you just think about looking at animals and how many lives are lost every year, mosquitoes are considered the world's deadliest animal. So this is just a graphic kind of showing how many people die per year from these different types of animals. And it shows different examples, like a hippopotamus kills 500 people a year, which I guess is surprising to me, but 25,000 are killed by dogs, snakes kill 50,000 people. And then obviously humans themselves killing other people. There's 475,000 deaths, but by far mosquitoes are the deadliest animal when you make this type of comparison. So just looking at mosquito-borne diseases and looking at the United States, you can kind of see where Texas fits in as far as the number of disease cases. So this represents 2004 through 2016, looking at the number of disease cases from mosquitoes throughout the US. And I actually looked up the numbers, and there's several states that are in the top 20%. But when you look at the individual states, I think Texas came out third as far as the number of disease cases for this time period. I think California had the most, and then it was New York, and then Texas was third. So Texas does need to be aware of mosquito-transmitted diseases because we are a vulnerable state. And I'll talk more about this later, but we have the climate and we have the type of environment that mosquitoes like. And so we are in a place where we need to be aware of what's circulating, what kind of viruses are circulating through mosquitoes. And this is another graphic from CDC. This kind of gives information about the most important vector-borne diseases in Texas. And this is comparing mosquito-borne and tick-borne diseases. And we do have tick-borne diseases in Texas, mainly the spotted fever, rickettsiosis, like Rocky Mountain spotted fever. But really, when you look at it overall, mosquito-borne diseases are more important in Texas. And that's what the pie chart shows. And then when you look at this line graph over here, this shows 2004 through 2018, and looking at the number of mosquito-borne diseases, that's kind of in a green color, and tick-borne diseases in orange. And typically there are more mosquito-borne diseases each year. And if you'll see in 2012, there was a big, large increase in mosquito-borne diseases, and that was related to a large West Nile virus outbreak in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, actually. So thinking about mosquitoes as disease vectors, as I mentioned on the earlier slide, disease vectors are typically hematophagous, so they need a blood meal for part of their life cycle. For mosquitoes, they use blood for egg production. So it's just the females that feed on blood, and they need it to nourish a batch of eggs. So when a female mosquito feeds on a host, during that feeding process, there's actually, when they're biting the host, they're putting their proboscis in, which I'm showing here in this graphic. This proboscis cannulates a vessel. This lip or labium pulls back. There's actually several different tubes in the proboscis. And while the mosquito is sucking up blood in one tube, it's also injecting saliva in a separate tube. So there's multiple tubes in this one proboscis. And when the mosquito injects saliva, there's several different components contained in the saliva. They inject anticoagulants so that the blood doesn't coagulate. They can inject an anesthetic so that you don't really feel them while they're feeding, and that's so that they can enjoy an uninterrupted meal. It contains vasodilators that makes the blood flow more quickly so they can get their meal faster. It also can contain immunomodulators, and this is to kind of suppress the immune response while they're feeding. And then obviously this is also a pathway where pathogens can be transmitted either to the host, or the pathogens can be taken up to the mosquito through the blood meal that they're feeding on. And just to give a little bit of information about when we're thinking about different mosquito species, I'm going to talk about this more later, but we have about 85 species of mosquitoes in Texas. And not all mosquitoes are important for transmitting viruses. And so when we think about what mosquitoes are important, there's different things we have to look at, and we typically put species into different categories, whether they're primary vector species or secondary vector species, if they play a role in transmission, or some mosquitoes won't play a role at all. And when we're thinking about whether a mosquito is an important vector, there's different components that play into that. So we think about vectorial capacity, and what that is, that's the overall ability of a vector species or a mosquito in a given location at a specific time to transmit a pathogen. And the different things that go into that are like vector density. How many, for example, how many mosquitoes are in a certain area? There has to be a certain population level for that species to be important for virus transmission. Host preference is important. You know, certain mosquitoes will only feed on people, or certain mosquitoes will only feed on birds, or some prefer frogs or different types of animals. So it's important what the mosquito prefers to feed on, and that can determine whether or not they're going to play an important role in virus transmission. Another factor is called extrinsic incubation period. And what that is that's the time from when a mosquito feeds on an infected host, they pick up a virus, and then the virus has to replicate in their body, and then they're able to transmit that virus again. So there's a certain amount of time that it takes for that process to occur. And that time can play into whether or not that mosquito will be an important vector or not. If it takes 2 weeks for that time period to happen, the mosquito might not live that long. But if a mosquito can take up a virus and then transmit it, within a week, that mosquito species might play an important role in transmission. And then longevity, how long that mosquito lives, is important. And then also vector competence. And vector competence is more of an intrinsic ability of a mosquito to be able to become infected, have the virus replicate in their body, and then be able to transmit that virus. So it's more of an internal, like a genetic ability of that mosquito to be able to serve as a vector. And just to kind of give a little bit of more information about that, this is a cross section of a mosquito. And what it's showing here is when a mosquito takes a blood meal, they're feeding here, and these circles are virus particles coming into the mosquito's body. The virus particles come into their midgut. And what has to happen is the virus has to be able to replicate and then cross different barriers inside of the mosquito and replicate in different tissues of their body. So it has to be able to get out of the midgut, cross these barriers. It has to replicate in tissues here, and then it actually has to replicate and cross barriers to get into the salivary glands before the mosquito can then transmit that virus to the next host. So like I said, not every mosquito is going to be able to transmit a virus. This all has to, their body has to be permissible to virus infection and replication so that the virus can then get in their salivary glands and be transmitted again. So that's what we call vector competence. And just to give some brief basic biology about mosquitoes, if you're not aware, the mosquitoes have multi-stage life cycle. So this kind of shows the different stages here of the mosquito life cycle. Here's the adult mosquito, which is obviously terrestrial, and they fly around. They do lay their eggs on or near water. So different species have different preferences. Culex mosquitoes that are important for West Nile transmission, they lay their eggs in rafts on water. Aedes species are a little different, and they would lay their eggs on damp leaf litter in areas prone to flooding. But ultimately, their immature stages, these larval forms, need water to grow, and preferably they need to be in water with lots of organic material so they have food. They have to go through 4 different larval instars, so they need food to eat so that they can continue to molt. And then finally, they go into this pupal stage. This is a non-feeding stage where the adult mosquito is actually forming inside of the pupal case. And then after only a few days, the pupa will go to the surface, and then it'll split open at the top, and then the adult mosquito will come out. onto the water surface and harden, and then the adult flies away after that. So that's a brief overview of the mosquito life cycle. And just to give a little bit more information about why they're classified the way they are. So obviously they belong to the kingdom Animalia, phylum Arthropoda, and this is because they do have an exoskeleton, they have a segmented body, and also jointed appendages. They're in the class Insecta. They have 3 body segments, and that's shown here in this diagram. They have a head, a thorax, and an abdomen. And then they have 6 legs. And then they belong to the order Diptera, and that's because they have 2 wings. And then the family is Culicidae, so that's where all the mosquitoes are Culicidae, or all Culicidae are mosquitoes. And this is characterized by a proboscis. This is the feeding tube I was referring to earlier. And they also have scales on their body and on their wings. So worldwide, there's over 100 genera. So there's quite a few genera. And then species, there's over 3,000 species worldwide. In the US, there are 176 different species that are documented. And in Texas, we have about 85 different species. And here's a view of a male and a female mosquito. So you can maybe impress your friends at a party and you can point out which is which. So here the female, these are Aedes aegypti mosquitoes. The female's usually larger, but what's really easy to tell them apart is if you look at their head, the antennae are very fluffy on the males, and we call that a plumose antennae. And the males also have long maxillary palps, whereas the female just has the proboscis. The male has these palps on the side of the proboscis. So the female is adapted for blood feeding, whereas the males just feed on nectar and plant juice and that sort of thing. But really the dead giveaway, if you are able to look at a mosquito, if it lands on your arm, if you see these fluffy antennae, it's a male and it's not going to bite you, so you don't have to worry. Males also have claspers on their terminal segment that look like little hooks. So that's another way to tell them apart, but these are harder to see. And the reason, actually, this is interesting, the reason the males have the fluffy antenna is that's how they find females of their species to mate with. So they can sense the wing beat pattern of females that belong to their species, and they sense it with these antennae, and that's how they find who they want to mate with. And looking at vector species in Texas, for us, I've listed some diseases that we've had historically in Texas. Some we've had some cases. For example, Zika and chikungunya, we've had a few cases of local transmission. Historically, we've had dengue cases along our border counties. Really, our most important arbovirus in Texas is West Nile. We also have St. Louis encephalitis, and I'll go through these a little bit more in detail. But just to show you our 2 genera that kind of transmit these different types of viruses are called Aedes. And then Culex species. Aedes species are darker colored and they have a pointed abdomen. You can see that here. And then Culex species are brown and more dull looking, and they have a rounder abdomen tip. But typically, these are the viruses that the Culex species will transmit. And then dengue, chikungunya, and Zika are transmitted by Aedes species in Texas. And I wanted to give an overview of the different transmission cycles. So as I mentioned, the Culex species, transmit these types of these viruses here, and then Aedes transmit different viruses. Well, they also have different types of transmission cycles. And when I'm talking about a transmission cycle, this is how these viruses are maintained in nature, and then how they spill over to infecting other humans and animals. So for a Culex cycle, for example, West Nile virus, the main transmission cycle is between mosquitoes and birds. And so that's how it's really maintained in nature is, a mosquito biting an infected bird. The mosquito takes up the virus replicates to a point where then it's able to transmit it to the next bird. And so it keeps cycling. Some of these other variables on this slide are just kind of showing there's different things that can affect a transmission cycle, like weather and climate can affect bird populations. Food, space, breeding site will affect bird populations. And then obviously these will also affect the mosquitoes, the mosquito population. If you have, lots of rain, you could have a large hatch off of a certain species of mosquito. So these are different factors that can play into an arbovirus transmission cycle. But as I mentioned, this is the main cycle in nature. But then you can also have these spillover events where then a mosquito may become infected after feeding on a bird, but then for a subsequent meal, it could feed on a human or a host. And those are called incidental hosts or dead-end hosts. And the reason, at least for West Nile, they're called that is because humans and horses don't develop a virus titer high enough to then infect another mosquito. In the natural transmission cycle here, with the mosquitoes feeding on the birds develop really high virus titers in their body. So, the mosquitoes feeding on them later will get infected. But that doesn't happen with horses and humans. We don't have enough virus replication in our body, so we don't keep the cycle going. So the cycle looks a little bit different when we're talking about the Aedes species. And for example, like Zika, chikungunya, dengue, or yellow fever, the main cycle in nature is between these Aedes species in forested areas and with primates. So that's the natural cycle in nature. And then when you have a spillover event, one of these mosquitoes could bite a human, and then you start an epidemic or urban cycle where then the virus is just transmitted between humans and mosquitoes. So for these viruses, humans do develop a high enough titer, or the virus replicates to a high enough level that another mosquito can pick up virus from that person and then keep the cycle going. So it's a very different type of cycle when you're thinking about like West Nile compared to, say, Zika virus. And now I'm going to go through kind of quickly the different viruses and talk about or kind of reiterate how they're transmitted in nature, and then talk about different symptoms and outcomes that can be associated with these different viruses. So as we just went over, there's the main transmission cycle in nature for West Nile virus is bird, mosquito, bird. And then sometimes you'll have these spillover events where a mosquito will then bite a human, which would be a dead-end host, or a horse, which would also be a dead-end host. And I think I also mentioned earlier, West Nile really is our most prevalent arbovirus of concern in Texas. And it has been since about 2002. That's when it was first introduced into Texas. And here's some facts about West Nile. So it was discovered back in 1937 in Uganda. It arrived or was first detected in the US in 1999. And as I mentioned, it's hypothesized that it was introduced by migratory birds. So it was first detected in 1999 in New York. And then by 2003, it had already gone through the whole US and was detected in California. So it was really fascinating how quickly it spread across the US in such a short amount of time. The primary vector species are two Culex species. So these are the most important vectors in Texas. It's Culex conchifasciatus and Culex tarsalis mosquitoes. The primary reservoir are birds. And then the different symptoms associated with West Nile are fever, body aches, joint pain, you can have a rash. With West Nile, if you can see this little diagram at the top, really about 20% of people who get infected will have some sort of symptoms like a fever and maybe some mild aches and pains. Most people will be asymptomatic. So according to this, about 80% of people won't really even notice that they got infected. And then there is a small portion, less than 1%, they may have more severe outcomes and have encephalitis or some sort of neurologic disease. And then older age is a risk factor for having more severe complications with West Nile infection. And that's what this graph shows here from the CDC. It shows incidence per 100,000 people, and it shows by age, and then just shows by increasing age, there is increasing incidence of neuroinvasive disease from West Nile virus. These are also graphs from CDC to show, the first one shows neuroinvasive disease incidence starting from 1999 when it was first introduced into the US, and then going to 2019. And I wanted to show this because this basically just demonstrates that ever since West Nile was introduced into the United States, we've had cases every year. So it's something that has showed up and definitely has not gone away. And we've actually had quite a bit of activity. We had in 2002 and 2003, that's when West Nile was really headed westward throughout the US, and there were a lot of susceptible people. And so we had a lot of activity and a lot of cases, but then the numbers kind of went down. But then we had this large outbreak in 2012, and that was actually mainly focused in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And then we've had steady activity every year. It did go down last year. 2019 was a pretty slow year nationwide for West Nile, but we did have an uptick last year, and I'll show you some Texas numbers in just a minute. And then this map just kind of shows where there's been more incidents of neuroinvasive disease in the US during this time period. So this is also showing data from 1999 to 2019. And more neuroinvasive cases or disease has been reported in the western half of the United States. And these numbers are just for Texas, and the time period here is from 2002 to 2018, and this is showing the number of reported cases of West Nile fever, and then also neuroinvasive disease, so the more severe complications or outcomes with West Nile. And again, you can see we've had activity from 2002 when we first detected it in Texas. And then in 2012, you can see we have this large peak, and that was that outbreak that occurred in Dallas. And then I wanted to just give a little snapshot from last year. So this map is put together by our zoonosis control branch, and it shows arbovirus activity for different arboviruses. But what I want to highlight on this slide is just the red counties. So each of the counties that are filled in with red, that's where there was West Nile virus activity documented, whether it was a human case or a positive mosquito pool or a viremic blood donor. So this kind of captures different types of virus activity that are reported to the state. But last year we did have 69 human West Nile virus cases that were reported. And almost 1,400 mosquito pools tested positive for West Nile. So we did have quite a bit of activity this past year. And I know the testing we did in our laboratory, we did find a lot of positive pools up in this area, especially in Tarrant County. So that's where we saw a lot of activity this past year. And I did want to mention, we work with Williamson County with their mosquito surveillance program. And I don't know if any of you are aware of the activity that was detected last year, but they are really good about doing press releases When our lab does testing and we detect West Nile in mosquitoes, they usually do a press release. And then I think they also put out signs sometimes at the park just to make people aware that West Nile has been detected in local mosquitoes. And so we work with them and their efforts to keep everybody safe. But they have a really nice program and a great team there. So I'm going to switch a little bit and talk about St. Louis encephalitis virus. So this is a virus that historically we've also had in Texas. It has a similar cycle to West Nile. So the main transmission cycle in nature is between mosquitoes and birds. And then you also have spillover events where the mosquitoes will then bite humans, which are then considered a dead-end host because the cycle stops there. But what's really interesting is about St. Louis is this virus actually was very prevalent in the United States prior to the arrival of West Nile virus. And we did have quite a few outbreaks historically throughout the US, but there's been a lot documented just in Texas of St. Louis encephalitis virus outbreaks. But once West Nile came through, it's almost like because they share a similar niche where they use the same vector species, Culex quinquefasciatus and Culex tarsalis, and they're also, in cycles, transmission cycles with birds. It's almost like West Nile has outcompeted St. Louis to a degree because now we have a lot more West Nile virus activity and outbreaks documented year to year compared to St. Louis. Now, that being said, we still pick up St. Louis encephalitis virus in mosquitoes. Usually every year we pick up a couple, but not nearly what the numbers we see with West Nile virus. And St. Louis is actually a lot less of a concern. So really less than 1% of people who get infected will have a clinical symptoms. So most people who get infected won't even know it for the most part. So very few people even notice that they're infected. You can have some symptoms like fever, headache, nausea, and it's very rare, but it's possible to have neurologic issues. It is an encephalitis virus, so that is a possibility to have that. And then also older age is a risk factor again with this virus. And here on this graph, this is a CDC graph showing the number of reported cases 2010 through 2019. And this is actually the total number of cases reported. And if you look at these numbers, these are not anything compared to what we were looking at with the West Nile numbers earlier. Earlier with West Nile, we were looking at incidents per 100,000 people. But these are actual just the number of cases. So with St. Louis, we don't see the number of cases that we see with West Nile. But this just shows that typically you do have a few cases every year throughout the US, and this map shows where they've had cases reported throughout the United States. And as you can see, we have had cases in Texas. And for this time period from 2010 to 2019, there were 6 human cases reported in Texas. And this is the same map I showed earlier for West Nile, but I'm going to highlight the SLE activity. And for this map, they're using these green diagonal lines to show where we did have SLE activity last year. So as you can see that we have several counties here down in South Texas. We have Nueces County and Clearwood County where we had activity. Lubbock, we did detect positive mosquito pools in Lubbock and also in El Paso County this past year. So in total, we had 16 positive mosquito pools for St. Louis, and then we did have 2 human cases this past year. And then next I want to talk about Eastern equine encephalitis virus, or we also call it triple E. This also has a transmission cycle with birds and mosquitoes, and that's how it's maintained in nature. And then again, humans serve as dead-end hosts. What's important about Eastern equine encephalitis virus is that it has a high mortality rate. So it's something to be aware of, and we do have, historically, we have had it in Texas, so it's something to be aware of. But fortunately, it's rare to have human cases. Now, a couple of years ago, there was a lot of activity of Triple E in the northeastern United States, and they did have quite a few human cases. But we haven't had a human case in Texas in a very long time, fortunately. When you think about the U.S. as a whole, most of the activity for Triple E is found east of the Mississippi River. The primary vector is Culicida melanura, but that's more in the northeastern part of the U.S. We actually aren't sure what the primary vector is in Texas, but it's been detected in lots of different species. So it's possible that there's just multiple species that play a role in transmission in Texas. And then birds, again, are the reservoir for the transmission cycle in nature. Symptoms for Triple E infection are kind of the same as the other viruses we've talked about: fever, headache, nausea. But there can be severe neurologic disease outcomes associated with this. And as I mentioned, there's a high mortality rate. If you become infected, 1 in 3 cases will result in death. So this is something you do not want to get, or you do not want circulating in your area. And even if you do recover, a lot of people are left with a long-term sequelae. So you can have brain damage or other problems associated, even if you do recover from the infection. And then younger people and people over 50 are at higher risk for severe outcomes. And this graph here shows activity, neuroinvasive disease from Triple E 2010 through 2019. And as I did mention, in 2019 or several years ago, there was quite a few human cases, and they were more located up in Michigan and Connecticut. And as you can see on this map here, we haven't had a human case of Triple E in a long time, or at least during this time span from 2010 to 2019. We have had horse cases. So I kind of just broke it down going back through the past several years. 2020, we did not detect any activity, but in 2019, and I have it shown here, we did pick up Triple E in 6 equine samples. And the counties are, it's kind of small, I know, but the counties are shown in this crisscross pattern, counties here. And I kind of put a circle around this part of the state because historically when we pick up Triple E in equine specimens, it's usually in this part of the state is where we found it historically. But just looking back through the years, 2018, we did not pick it up in anything. We've had several equine cases going back 2017 to back to 2014. And then also Galveston County is, I believe, the only county in Texas that does sentinel chicken testing. And what they do is they set out these coops of chickens in different parts of their county, and then they go and draw their blood once a month, and they run serology testing, and they look for antibodies to different viruses. And historically, these chickens have seroconverted for Triple E, and so there has been Triple E activity also in Galveston at different times. And it looks like we picked it up in 2016 and 17, but we haven't seen it in the past couple of years. And then just to keep moving, I wanted to talk about some of these other viruses. These are transmitted by Aedes mosquitoes. These aren't viruses that we see a lot of prevalence in, but they are something we need to be aware of because Texas has had local transmission of these viruses, especially along the border. We do see imported cases more frequently, but we have had sporadic cases of local transmission. And as I showed earlier, these are the viruses that can be transmitted human, mosquito, human. And the primary vector species are these two Aedes species, Aedes aegypti, which is here, and it has this lyre-shaped pattern on the thorax, and then Aedes albopictus, which is shown here, and it kind of looks like a skunk, and it has like a white stripe on its thorax and on its head. And just to show the distribution of these two species in the US, so once Zika virus came big news and CDC was concerned about what was going to happen and how transmission was going to play out in the United States, there was a big push to find out where these vector species were located and where there was the potential for transmission of Zika virus and even chikungunya virus at the time. And so CDC put out a lot of requests for data and asked different local health departments and state health departments to provide mosquito data so that they could create these models or maps to kind of show where these species were distributed so they could make risk assessments as far as transmission for Zika and chikungunya. And then more locally, as the state health department, we wanted to know within Texas where these vector species were located. So we started collaborations with different universities, Texas A&M AgriLife, Texas Tech, UTRGV in South Texas, and then University of Texas El Paso. We worked with these different universities to go out and collect mosquito eggs in different counties, rear out the mosquitoes and find which species were located in those counties. So you can see this map here. This is what we started with in 2015. We had our records based on collections and identifications made in our laboratory. And that's kind of what we started with. And then after working with these different collaborators, we've been able to fill in a lot of the gaps and find out where these species are located throughout the state, which has been a nice resource to have. And going forward, I think it'll be a good resource. So just to talk about some of these viruses quickly, dengue virus is actually a group of viruses. There's 4 closely related viruses, dengue 1 through 4. It's one of the most fastest spreading mosquito-borne diseases in the world. So it's a big concern worldwide. Here in the US, there's really only been transmission really in South Texas and then in Florida. But it's been present, or there has been activity in the US at least since the 1700s. But now it's mostly associated with travelers. So we have traveler associated cases for the most part. The primary vectors are Aedes aegypti and albopictus, as I mentioned. The reservoirs can be humans or primates, depending on where the cycle is occurring. And then the different symptoms associated with dengue are fever, headache, joint pain, or rash. Here's an example of a rash associated with dengue infection. And with dengue, about 20% of people who get infected will have some symptoms. So really, most people who do get infected won't have symptoms. So about 80% will not have symptoms at all. Now, what's a complication with dengue is with these 4 different serotypes circulating, if you get infected with one serotype, you develop antibodies to it. And then later on, you have a subsequent infection with a different serotype. Your antibodies facilitate a more severe infection with that second infection. And then you can have outcomes like dengue hemorrhagic fever, where your body is hemorrhaging. And then you can also have dengue shock syndrome, where your organs are shutting down. So really, there are more severe outcomes associated with dengue, but it's really when you're in an area where there's multiple serotypes circulating, and you have multiple infections with different serotypes. And this is the same map that I showed earlier, but here I'm wanting to highlight dengue virus activity, and that's highlighted here in the blue outline. So actually last year we had local transmission, and when I say local transmission, that means people who had these cases of dengue did not report any travel. So it's assumed that they were infected by a mosquito that bit them where they live. And so based on that, we have 9 cases that were reported last year, and these cases were found in Webb County here, and then in Hidalgo County down in South Texas. Chikungunya virus is another Aedes transmitted virus. It was first detected in the Americas in 2013 in the Caribbean islands. Local transmission has been documented in Florida and in Texas, but the last time this occurred was in 2014 and 2015. So this was a big concern about 6 years ago, but right now it's not a major concern. It's just something that we want to be aware of because it could come back in circulation again. So it's something we keep on our radar, but it's not currently circulating in Texas or even close to Texas. Again, the primary vectors are Aedes aegypti and albopictus. It has the same reservoirs as dengue, so it's humans and then also non-human primates. With chikungunya, it's a little bit different because with this virus, most people who get infected will have symptoms. So it's kind of flipped where 80% of people who get infected will have some sort of symptom, and then 20% will not have symptoms. So with this virus, most people do get sick. They will have fever, they will have joint pain, and it can last for a while and it can be disabling. But there's rarely any severe outcomes, like there's really not any deaths or mortality associated with chikungunya infection. It's more joint pain, and sometimes it can last for a long time. Older populations are more at risk for persistent joint pain. But like I said, it's really not associated with mortality rates. And this map just shows where chikungunya has been documented throughout the world. And like I said, right now, there really isn't any concern of chick circulating in Texas or even close to Texas. But it's something we like to remain diligent about and keep it on our radar. And then Zika virus, which I'm sure most of you have heard about, is something that we were, it was big news several years ago. Significant history, just some important notes. This is something where it was very interesting that an arbovirus was associated with vertical transmission with severe outcomes. So this was something new where an arbovirus infection was transmitted from mother to a fetus, and then it resulted in these severe birth defects like microcephaly. And then also the documentation of sexual transmission is not something you would normally see with a mosquito transmitted disease. So that was something that was kind of out of the ordinary and not expected. Again, these are the same vector species, Aedes aegypti and albopictus. The reservoirs are humans and non-human primates. Symptoms, if you get infected, can be very mild: fever, headache, joint pain, or rash. And the severe outcomes are really associated with the infection during pregnancy, which can have severe birth defects. And this just goes through the different methods. So, the primary transmission can be between mosquitoes and people. And then there can also be these other transmission methods where it can be passed from mother to child, and also it can be sexually transmitted. And then blood transfusions is another method of transmission. And this map just shows where Zika has been documented and transmission has been shown to occur throughout the world. And just to highlight what we had in Texas, this was quite a few years ago, but we had local transmission occurring in Texas back in 2016, where we had people with Zika who did not report any travel. So it was assumed that they got infected by mosquito bites, and that happened in 2016 and in 2017. And this local transmission occurred down in South Texas in Cameron and Hidalgo counties. We also had a lot of cases that were traveler associated, and those numbers have all gone down in recent years, and we haven't had any local transmission of Zika that we're aware of since 2017. And I just wanted to bring this up in case anybody's wondering. Obviously we're still in a pandemic and worried about COVID-19, but there have been some studies done to look at whether or not mosquitoes can transmit SARS-CoV-2. And based on experiments that have been done, it doesn't look like these viruses replicate or can be transmitted by these vector species that they evaluated. Now, obviously, they didn't test every mosquito species possible, but based on initial findings, it doesn't look like this would be an important form of transmission for SARS-CoV-2. And I'm running out of time, so I'll briefly go through some of these prevention strategies. There are vaccines available for just a few arboviruses for humans. So there's one for yellow fever, and then also Japanese encephalitis. There's actually not that many available for humans. There's more vaccines available for horses really than humans, but there are some that are in development currently. A lot of prevention has to do with mosquito control. So a lot of counties and cities have programs in place where they use integrated pest management programs to monitor and control their vector species or their mosquito populations. And obviously then there's personal protections that you can use to keep yourself safe from different mosquito transmitted diseases. And these are the 4 Ds that are promoted federally, and then we also promote this as a state. So you want to dress appropriately when you're going to be outside and mosquitoes are going to be around. You want to defend yourself with mosquito repellent. At dusk and dawn, those are key times when mosquitoes are out feeding. And so those are times you want to be extra careful when you're outside, or maybe just stay inside during those times. And then also to be careful to drain water around your home so that you're not breeding mosquitoes in your area. And here's some information just about looking at how to choose what repellent you want to use. And I would recommend looking on the CDC website or the EPA website to get more information. But there's guidelines depending on how long you're going to be outside, what's the best product to use, what you should use on your clothing to keep yourself safe. And just some general guidelines. You want to use repellent when mosquitoes are going to be around. Put it on your exposed skin or clothing. You want to avoid wounds or any kind of irritated skin. Obviously, you don't want to spray it in your mouth or close to your eyes. And then reapply it as needed per the label instructions. And then with children, you need to be careful not to use repellent on infants younger than 2 months of age. You want to be careful about the percentage of DEET that you're using, and then also be careful not to spray it on them, but then spray it on your hands and then rub it on your child is a more safe method to apply for children. And then there's also repellents for clothing and gear when you're heading out camping. And these products are made specifically for gear. It's not for your skin, but it's made to treat your clothes or shoes or your bed net or your tent. So it's just important to follow the label instructions. And then I want to finish by just showing a few what I consider to be beautiful mosquitoes. I get to look at mosquitoes every now and then in our lab, and there are quite different colors and patterns with different mosquito species, even in Texas. So it's something to appreciate. I know not everybody takes the time to look at a mosquito. Usually you're just wanting to swat them or smash them, but some mosquitoes are very beautiful and they have different patterns and colors, and so they can be fun to look at. And then again, I just wanted to say thank you for this opportunity to talk about what I do and what I enjoy. And then I'm happy to get questions or comments. And here's my contact information if anybody wants to reach out. And I will stop sharing.
Okay,
And
great. We do have a couple questions. Somebody was wanting, don't get DEET on your optics either. It's your binoculars or cameras. It's not good for those.
okay.
But we had a question that says, has the decline in the diversity of species like plants, insects, and animals in an area contributed to an increase of mosquito-borne infections here in Texas?
That's a good question. I'm not sure that or how that relationship would work. I would say there's definitely a possibility. What's interesting to me about mosquito-borne diseases is they're multivariate. There's so many factors that play into mosquito-borne diseases, just because, as one of the graphs I showed earlier, there's so many things that play into it, like the weather, different animal populations, breeding areas, for the animals that are reservoirs, and then the mosquitoes themselves, the weather plays into their population. And so all these factors can play into whether or not a mosquito-borne disease is active one year or not. Now, definitely, if there's a certain animal that's an important reservoir for a certain virus transmission cycle, that would have an effect if those animals aren't as numerous. But I don't really have an example in mind of that. But that's a really good question.
Okay, and somebody else said they've got some mosquitoes in their house from summer until December. They've checked their plants and didn't see anything. Do they breed in unused sinks?
That's a possibility, yes. And mosquitoes can overwinter. So you can have mosquitoes kind of hang out in your house and kind of make it through the winter and head on out when the weather's nice again. So you can't, depending on what the weather conditions are, you can't have mosquitoes in your home through the winter months. And they're more kind of hibernating. It's really not called hibernating, but they're trying to escape the colder elements outside. But yes, it is possible if there is water collecting in certain parts of your house and maybe you just can't see it, they could be breeding in drains. And we did actually have that happen at work several years ago, where there was a water collecting because of a pipe problem, and there were mosquitoes showing up in the offices, and that's what it turned out to be. So that's definitely a possibility.
Wow, so I guess they don't really need much water to breed then.
No, it's actually very little. Depending on the species, you don't need much. I mean, I've heard a cap from a Pepsi bottle, or even a spoon, just a little bit of water. And if the water stays there for a certain amount of time, they have to go through their life stages. But if the water stays there, even if it's a little bit, they can complete their life cycle and breed.
Wow, interesting. And then somebody asked, do you know what insecticides are used for the citywide spraying for West Nile?
No. So I can't speak to the mosquito control efforts. I do work with the local agencies in Austin and also Williamson County in different areas with their surveillance efforts. But as far as mosquito control, I'm not the person to speak about what they do or what their stance is. And I know like in Texas, there's really no mandate as how you address mosquito control, and everybody has their own way of doing it. So even cities, close by each other may handle it very differently. But I'm sure Austin and I think, different, Round Rock and Cedar Park, they all have their own plans in place for mosquito issues, but I don't have that information as far as what products may or may not be used.
All right. Well, I don't see any more open questions right now. I did notice on one of your slides, it was from the Orange County area, and having been born and raised there, I know that they definitely do a lot of mosquito stuff there.
Yeah, they do. They have a great program, actually. We work a lot with them. So
great. Well, thank you very much for a very interesting presentation.
thank you.
We'll be watching out for first mosquitoes. Thanks everybody for joining us. Please join us next month when we'll on February 27th when we'll be hearing from another Friends group, this time from the Friends of Berry Springs. And then our speaker will be Katie Boyer from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Department, speaking on monarch conservation. So once again, thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you next month.